This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas and everything in between. This episode is brought to you by Yeshiva University's Center for Israel Studies and the Schneier Program for International Affairs. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is an associate professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva. He's the author of a new book called Jewish Culture, A Quick Immersion. It was recently published by Thibodeau Publishing.
Yes.
Professor Jess Olson, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Oh, thank you very much for having me.
So I'd like to start by spending some time on the phrase "a quick immersion" that is in the title. And when I saw it and started reading some of the justification, I thought that it might be a contradiction in terms. Because as you write specifically for Judaism, unlike Christianity and Islam, it's never quick, right? So what do you have to say about that?
So the title is somewhat forced upon me. Mm-hmm. It's the nature of the series. Actually, it's a series modeled after I think both Oxford and Cambridge have put out a quick introduction. I don't know the names of those series, but it's kind of entry into that market. And the series title collectively is Quick Immersion. So I was immediately kind of stuck with the title. It became kind of a methodological question as to how do I get around that? How do I, do exactly what you're saying, which is to square the circle of the fact that the subject has no quick immersion.
But immersion is specifically problematic because it could be a quick introduction, a prelude, a preview. I mean, there are 1,000 other words. It could be.
I keep imagining you really it's Erev Shabbos, it's really late and you have to just go to the mikvah really fast and you just dip in and the depths are greater than the time passed of the immersion itself. I mean, I'll just go with that. Gosh, I guess I would have thought of a better series.
All right.
But I mean.
Another methodological challenge is condensing so much stuff into 130 pages or so. No, a bit more. It's the digital version was 130 pages.
Right.
This is the printed one is just under 200.
Yeah.
How do you choose what issues to leave out and what issues to tackle only superficially?
Right. I felt like I was working on multiple axes, right? It was kind of how I was thinking about it. I was thinking it was almost like a problem, right? There's a question of just sheer time passage. I'm a historian, so I'm always thinking in terms of that kind of frame of reference. As we've been talking about in this class, the idea of thinking about time historically or in sort of the form of historicism is itself not a given in any project. So that was kind of how I started. The other axis is, there are issues that are so central to the lived Jewish life of people who are going to read this book, right, or going to react to it. Those things have importance and value. And I also think that I did believe in this project as a certain degree of, as every historian or academic probably does, is a bit of a corrective on things that I see out there. What I was really interested in is kind of creating as grand and seamless a picture, right? The question that I started out with, if I had to sit down and explain to somebody, what is Jewish culture? Like, how would you even start to answer that question? How would you break it down? How would you, and so one axis of kind of consideration became, how do you actually not condense, but how do you break things up? I mean, do we work on working from a chronological, kind of approach would make sense. Working from a thematic approach would make sense. And both of those things have been done in other texts like this. I realized that neither of those were very satisfying to me. Chronologically, it honestly seemed dull. Approaching it thematically, you have the same issues of what themes are in or what are out. What do I privilege? What do I exclude? And what I realized the best way to do is to kind of tell the same story through three different lenses, right? And so that's what that's how I came down.
We'll get to that in a second. So would you say that it's sort of like under the genre of letters to a non-Jewish friend, sort of?
It's better than Judaism for Dummies, which is what, whenever I explain it to somebody, so you're writing Judaism for Dummies, and I'm saying,
right,
maybe I don't know,
but it is.
I don't mean to insult my audience, by the way. I hope that wasn't.
But the target audience that you're looking at was a sympathetic outsider,
hopefully. Yeah.
Look, clearly it's someone who wants to learn more. So
right. I had in mind some amorphous sort of person, who would, see this book on a Amazon list of things, or on a shelf or something, and it would, kind of be interested to read. I also realized, though, as I was writing it, that I really was talking as well to people who, do know a lot about the subject. That what I'm hoping to put out there is another perspective, not just for one who has no perspective. In fact, I don't think anybody should take my words as the only perspective that they get on the subject. I would hope that it would be an entree to a deeper interest. Mm-hmm. But for those of us who already have a fair amount of engagement and encountering with the subject, I would hope that it would also bring, at least, if not something to disagree with about what I'm saying, at least something to engage in a discussion. So that's...
Is that why there's a specific emphasis on American Jewish culture?
I mean, to me, you felt that way.
I felt that maybe because I'm reading it as an Israeli. I felt that there's it's kind of inviting a specific American audience.
I think that's an interesting reaction. I hoped that it would not be so, be particularly weighted in one direction or another in terms of communities or focus, right? But I think it reflects where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Honestly, I didn't intend to privilege the American experience.
No, I don't think you privileged it, but it was covered
more extensively. I have to say that as I do kind of discuss in the book, right? I mean, we're talking about the two sort of largest, centers of Jewry in the world to this day, which is a significantly new development in Jewish history, is Israel and the United States, right? This didn't exist 150 years ago. And I would imagine that probably that came more as just a happenstance of me being more centered in this particular community, that it becomes, I would guess it becomes kind of like, they talk in linguistics of a sort of hidden standard that I'm comparing things to really kind of unconsciously almost in terms of how I conceptualize a project. So I imagine that's probably where that comes from.
Yeah.
But it really wasn't intentional. That wasn't by design, honestly.
So now let's get to the crux of the issue, which is that it revolves around three axes: religion, family and community, and nation. Can you tell us a bit how you reached that methodological decision?
I kind of feel like it's a way that people often talk without knowing that that's how they talk. In fact, you actually hear this kind of discourse. I've heard it a lot in the media these days with, unfortunately, because of so much of the issues of anti-Semitism and these kind of things. People trying to explain, what Jews are, right? Why is this particular comment offensive? Why is that? I'm not saying I approach the whole thing through anti-Semitism, but to me, it seems like this is just often how people break it down, right? And when I kind of thought to myself, how would it make the most sense to a person, and also give the fullest picture possible? Because the other Yetzer Hara, the other temptation, is to kind of pick the thing you're most comfortable with, right? It'd be very easy for me as a historian to write a history book, and that was not what I was asked to do, right? I wasn't asked to write a history of Judaism. I was asked to write an immersion in Jewish culture. Well, of course, history is a very important part of that, as is religious identity, as is community and society, as is the state of Israel, right? I think those things kind of are often thrown out there. They're not necessarily put together in a way to kind of give a more comprehensive idea that all of these things are active. Sometimes, as I say kind of in the introduction, like every person who identifies with Judaism feels these three things one way or another to greater or lesser degree. They're like three different metrics that encapsulate, I think, much of the discourse on the subject. So that's kind of how
it's interesting that, the departure point was Jewish culture, which is like the broadest perhaps term,
Right.
and the three axes were kind of a breakdown of so which came first. So it was culture, and then you broke it down.
So they gave me a title.
Yeah,
right? Going back to this, right? You think you have control over your writing?
No, but it's funny that they gave you the title of Jewish culture because it's the most auspicious one.
I don't know if this is going to be politically incorrect. I don't know if they knew what they were asking when they said Jewish culture. I honestly don't. I was stymied by it a little bit. You know, when I said I was excited to do the project, one of the things that I was reluctant, I was like, what do they really mean Jewish culture? Do they really just not know what they mean? Mm-hmm. And Jewish culture is what they came up with. I decided I'll just go with the second one, not ask anybody, and write the book that I write. And that's how it came. I did think, though, that it became, I struggled with it a little bit, you know, because I'm like, I'm really not just talking about culture unless I define culture in such a completely overarching way that it almost loses coherence. But I did it anyway. And I guess I might say I kind of fudged it a little bit, right? You know, I mean, what is culture? Well, I'm going to call it this. Yeah. And that's what I went with. But the funny thing is, it's the constraints of the project that really sort of lent me the questions that I was grappling with methodologically. So that's sort of an interesting thing I discovered.
Yeah, and I think that the most interesting one is really how do you separate these three themes into three separate.
Well, they're not. I mean, they're not separate, right? I mean,
you know, because they're not separate. They can't be separate. That's the whole point of Judaism, right?
Exactly.
And so I'm wondering, like, when I read it, I said to myself, when he was writing each of these chapters, like, there's so many times that, you know, one thing that was here could be easily included in the other chapters. Can you tell us a bit about that? How much trouble did it give you?
The part I was more concerned about was redundancy, right? I didn't want to have to. I mean, I make it clear. Look, I'm telling, you know, it's like looking at the same subject from three different lenses, and indeed, it's possible to look at the same aspect of the subject in three different ways. What I tended to do was kind of select based upon where I thought the most coherence for a certain subject would fit. It made more sense to me, for instance, to talk about the evolution, or not the evolution, but the development of rabbinic culture from Chazal through the poskim, right? In talking about religion, and talking about the religious component of Jewish identity, right? Because that seemed more coherent to me than to talk about it. I mean, it is a historical story. I mean, I do present it in a historical way, but the focus is on halakha. The focus is on the idea of how, you know, this culture collectively understood itself in different places at different times through different lenses, right? So it usually came down to, you know, where does this, you know, talking about the history of anti-Semitism leading up to political Zionism in the 1890s, right? To me, that made more sense as a story of history, right? As a more recent, right? It fit better within the kind of, I would say, methodological rubric of thinking about it historically than, say, culturally, although then that also fits. You know, I mean, so what I ended up doing was thinking about, okay, how do I sort of, you know, if I again, my sort of hypothetical reader, right? If I was thinking about a person who identified in some way, I imagine a reader who doesn't have, let's say, an American Jewish person who doesn't. My mother-in-law. I'll give a shout out to my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law, very, very strongly identifying Reform Jew, very, very committed. Doesn't know the first thing about Gemara. Doesn't know the first. Like, how would she, you know, recognize herself? That's the same thing as learning something that doesn't, you know, turn her off or make her, like, you know, fall into judgments that she has about, right? So I tried to pick these discrete subjects within each section based upon where I thought the narrative made the most sense in the story I was trying to tell. And I said in the beginning, in the introduction, I kind of tried to put it this way, right? You know, you could take a sample of random Jews, right? Mm-hmm. Talk to this person, you know, let's say a Haredi Israeli whose identity, you know, is very strongly based on commitment to the Shulchan Aruch, commitment to their community, commitment to, you know, where they're not, the idea of nationalism is not such a strong idea, or maybe it is, you know, or an American who has no connection, who goes to the Seder with his parents, you know, once a year, maybe goes, you know, Shul and Yom Kippur, but otherwise, you know, doesn't really identify any strong, you know, they have a certain relationship. And so the idea is to kind of like, how can I catch as many of these in one place and make it coherent.
Because your mother-in-law, for example, we're going to come back to Beta throughout the interview, but she would write a very different book, judging from what you say.
Yes.
Did you think that you might get a lot of flack?
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, I work in Jewish studies and publish. I mean, it's it's like part of.
But were you trying to preempt that in any way?
It was always on my mind. One of the main things that I'm concerned about is not misrepresenting ideas or groups that I'm talking about that maybe I have a closer or more distant relationship to. Right. There are issues that I bring up that are contentious within my community. And outside of my, right, issues where I could imagine somebody sort of, using it as ammunition to make a certain argument. But the best I could do was to approach it with, sort of a very, as being as open and straightforward, at the same time having a certain commitment to an idea that I do have. Right? I mean, there is a positive component of what I'm thinking about in how I present the subject. Things that are important to me that I think need to be a part of a study like this that maybe I haven't seen elsewhere. People are going to disagree. I mean, I think that a lot of it is pretty parv. I don't think I'm saying anything that's particularly, shocking.
No, but we all have our blind spots.
So of course.
No, so I'm thinking, I know it's not your decision to make, but do you think they might have been? I don't know if better, but what about trying to make it a collaborative effort of sorts? I'll give you an example. Recently, I interviewed the publisher of a book that came out through the Central Council of American Rabbis, a book about American Jews and Israelis imagining the Israeli nation, right? And it was broken down to several chapters. Each written in tandem by an Israeli and an American. So one dedicated to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, another to, religious pluralism, and there was like a long list of chapters, each written by two people, which I thought was, it's really the essence of dialogue and really how an issue could be tackled in the broadest and most pluralistic way. I'm not saying this to trash you or anything. Quite the contrary, because but I'm trying to imagine what it would have been like if it was done in this way.
I take your question kind of in a certain way, like where I kind of think, wow, what collaboration would I have liked to make this the perfect book, right? It's sort of how I think about it.
Yep.
Now, for me, the first thought I have is I would definitely get a person who does Bible, who does, who could walk me through things that, or not walk me through, but would present a story that I think would be a little bit more robustly sophisticated than perhaps what I would be able to do. The idea of hashkafic difference, should we say, or of difference of worldview, is interestingly, I think this is a blind spot of mine, was less of a concern for me. Maybe it's because I feel like I talk to a lot of people, and I know whatever. But funny, the idea of collaboration, or when I kind of found myself, gosh, I wish I had somebody else to talk to, and I did ask a few colleagues questions here and there when I found gosh, I wish I knew more about this, or was working with someone who knew more about this, so I don't say anything really stupid.
Like what?
That was exactly. Oh, I don't know. I hope I didn't say anything.
What issues did you feel you needed more?
Where I feel the most nervous is really talking, about really the deepest roots of our tradition, right? I mean, I feel like that's where we're most sensitive, and that's where the most kind of care and nuance is necessary, and it's very important to me, and it's very important to where I work, right? I mean, that we take our Masorah very seriously.
Can you give a specific example of something?
The subject of the obvious subject. I mean, the obvious subject that hit me over the head from day one was, okay, I'm trying to explain what Judaism is to someone who maybe doesn't really have a clear concept of what that is. Maybe someone who doesn't even know what the Bible is. Maybe someone who doesn't even know, like somebody, because here we are in 2020. I think there are such people, right? Who, and
They probably wouldn't read your book. No offense.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, say this hypothetical person who happened to be curious. I worry about, saying something that might be misconstrued by them or might be seen by someone who knows more as being interpreted the wrong way by someone who didn't have the knowledge to be able to discern. That was what concerned me, which it may be a very particular concern given, my identity and where I work and my community. But, that was sort of honestly, that's the thing that bothered me the most. The other thing that concerned me was, politics, right? Politics are tough these days, right? And it's absolutely necessary to talk about Israel. I mean, it's a crucial, integral part of our identity and our culture, and it's something that must be written about in a book like this. You got to be very careful, right? I mean, because you're writing a 200-page book. It's so nuanced. It's so complicated. It's so. How do you get through that without saying the wrong thing? You're always going to say the wrong thing to somebody potentially, but how to say the wrong thing that only upsets the people who are just going to be upset no matter what, and not everybody else, I guess.
Yeah, I would think, going back to what you said earlier in this response, that it's not really for, also in the beginning of this conversation, it's not for dummies.
No.
It's not for people who don't know anything.
Right.
It's for people who know something or think they know something, but want to know more and know for certain what they think they know or should know. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, my poor Sue, my mother-in-law, I feel really bad about this. But when I say my imaginary reader, I really do think it was kind of my mother-in-law, Sue, who I just, I love her to pieces. But I mean, like, she's the type of person who I think would read this and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Now I understand why my daughter and son-in-law, drive me crazy with the dishes and and why we can't ever, bring things into their house. That makes sense now. It gives it a context, right? At the same time, her passion and interest in the world, in the Jewish world, is genuine and deep. But she maybe just hasn't had the opportunity to read as much as I mean, I do this for a living, and so to communicate to someone that was sort of
that's interesting, because basically what you're saying is that some people who are deeply engaged in one or several aspects of Judaism may know little or nothing about other aspects, and this is perhaps an attempt to give a panorama of like all the aspects, so basically you're inviting the reader to, in a way, pick and choose. Exactly,
yeah. In fact, that was kind of very much in my mind with the division. So, I mean, I don't know how many of my students have looked at this, but it's divided into essentially 3 chapters, right? One deals with religion, one deals with community and family, and one deals with nation. Actually, you mentioned that. And the whole idea was, start with what you know, right? Start with what you think you know. Start with the thing that seems interesting to you. You're interested in Israel. You're interested in the history of the nation. Start there. You're interested in Jewish, which I always imagine that a person coming to the subject is going to come and the first curiosity is going to be like, well, what is Judaism, right? And so the religion chapters is first, right? Because that seemed to make the most sense. So yeah, I definitely had the idea that you could kind of not exactly a choose your own adventure, but sort of in that vein of I wanted it to be sort of, it's not a linear book. Right, it doesn't. It's not a linear book. Yeah, which I also think our culture is not a linear culture.
Yeah. All right. We have a bit of time now for questions from Yeshiva University students who are in this room. So if anyone has got a question to Professor Olson, please raise your hands and come forward to the mic.
Okay. So you mentioned how picking and choosing was a highly topic about the book, but like in regards to like hashkafa and halakhically, like picking and choosing is not really how it goes. Like for an example, like a Sephardi won't be able to like paskin like the Gra,
right.
Or Ashkenazi can't really. He could use the insight that's given from like a Yebi Omer, but can't really make it the way that they follow their law and their hashkafa. So like, how does the book handle that situation?
That's a great question. That was something that was very important to me. Was to actually show the diversity. Specifically within religious practice, right? Like that. Well, there is no one particular. I mean, it's complicated, right? You have a Masorah, but there are different, kind of minhagim, right? So how do you explain that? And those minhagim tend often to be based upon geographical and cultural differences. So that becomes a very important way. So that's the way I approach it, right? It's not that I'm saying one way or the other is the way things are done, but what I'm saying is there is an important part of, right, even the sort of unity of Judaism is the diversity within the unity. And so that was very important to me, to sort of explain how that happens, right, and how that works practically. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So if you had to redo the title of the book, because as you said, you didn't get a chance to choose it.
Yeah.
That one defining phrase that you wanted people to get from the book, what would that be?
Oof.
I'm being overshadowed here by great interviewers.
That is a really hard question.
Yeah.
I'm kind of really starting to like a quick immersion, honestly. I guess it would be something to the effect. I mean, the main. I'll just say the main idea. I guess I'm trying to get across is, unity and complexity, right? The unity of a common, collective sense of identity that's shared even across degrees of religious practice, across geographically where we live and how we identify, right? That diversity itself is a central part of the value, or a central part of a central constituent. I'm tripping over myself. A central kind of constructive element of Jewish unity is a result of this diversity, right? And that this diversity is what is fascinating and what should be understood. That's kind of the main idea. So I would maybe call it, Jewish culture unity through diversity or something like that. I don't know. Like, I don't know. That sounds so mamby-pamby. I don't have a good answer, so I'm just going to say it, but I don't know. That's what I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in that. I'm trying to talk about not one subject, but many, 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 many subjects all under the same umbrella that need to, that really are in discourse with each other. And that's the way I approached it, right? That there is not one single story to tell, but collectively the multiple stories create an overarching fabric. That's how I kind of thought about it, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Would you say in writing the book that your primary goal was more documenting history or more to educate those that don't necessarily have the basic understandings that you chose to write about?
Definitely the second one. But in terms of documenting history, the idea is less the book is not, we didn't really talk about the sort of mechanics. The book is not a monograph, an academic monograph, right? It's very much written in plain language with no footnotes. Maybe there's a footnote, but no, a discursive footnote to just, define a term or something. There's no citations. I give a list of suggested readings at the end. So I'm not kind of documenting history in so much as I'm trying to kind of give a perspective on history, right? To bring together the various views that as a working historian, as a working Jewish historian, I deal, as we know, because this is what we're doing in this class, I deal with historiography. I mean, that's kind of the thing that I think about, right? And so in terms of history in the book, that was kind of my methodological, I guess, like platform to think about the bigger question, right? So history kind of serves me. It's the way I'm going to tell a story. A person who does literature might tell it a different way. A rabbi would tell it a different way. As a historian, this is the way I kind of approached telling various stories. That's how I would put it. But for people, who have less, who aren't going to be able to pick up and read a dense, footnoted. They're not going to read Salo Baron's, 20-volume history, social and religious, whatever the title, social and religious history of the Jewish people. Not going to happen. And so this is I hope, not to. I should say, Lahavdil, I am no Salo Baron. I have not written a 20-volume history of anything, but not many people are going to read that. And I'm hoping more people will read this. But anyway.
So I think this is probably a very important book, just as you mentioned, people will, hopefully see it on the shelf and be curious and pick it up. So in a way, it's kind of an authority. People will view you as like an authoritative figure in their knowledge of like a Jewish culture. So not in an attacking way at all. Mm-hmm. But what in your background, in your scholarship, makes you feel that you could be an authoritative figure for something like this, as opposed to, you mentioned that a rabbi would write it differently, as opposed to a rabbi or somebody who comes from a different denomination of Judaism? What makes you feel authoritative?
No, it's a great question, and it's really something that I take very seriously. Not that I am an authority, but that it's not my place to claim authority that isn't mine. I try to make it clear, and I think I do in the book. Make it pretty clear that I'm not coming from as a rabbinic authority on which, because that's where I'm very sensitive to, right? The last thing I want to do, right, is be accused of trying to talk out of school about something that I'm not qualified to talk about. That's something I'm very concerned about. As far as what I regard authority would be in the presentation of the book, I guess I would think of it more as an informed conversationalist, right? A person who I don't claim any particular authority except for that I did a lot of graduate work. I live in this world. I practice, as an Orthodox Jew. I've studied in Yeshiva. I've done all of the things that kind of give me the way to kind of talk about the things that I want to talk about. But I'm trying to be very careful about putting myself forward as in any way having some kind of authoritative view. In fact, I say it very quick. A lot of people could tell the story in a very different way, and I respect that. And in fact, welcome it. This is just my contribution. I consider this more as opposed to being an important authoritative book. I really appreciate that you think it might be. But what I really see it as more, it's an interesting contribution to the conversation that's going on. It's my view. I do have some credentials, but
yeah, the problem is it might be perceived this way by the lay reader.
Well,
but I think you take quite a bit of precautions in writing.
I do try
saying
to.
that it cannot and should not be interpreted as such.
Yeah, well, there's only so much I can do. Hopefully, people read the introduction and see all of that.
Yeah.
But I just want to emphasize though, it's something that I appreciate the question because it's something that I really do take quite seriously. I try to approach my work as a historian with humility. I often think, well, the minute I set pen to paper on any subject, there's got to be at least 10 people who've thought of this before me. So know what they said. Try to have an understanding before part of it is self-preservation. I don't want to, come off as an idiot. I don't want to speak out of school about things I don't really understand. But also it's part of respect. I respect people who have more expertise than I do in a certain subject. And so I try to, that's how I approached it.
So if the audience of this book is towards non-Jews, is there anything that somebody who's not Jewish could take out from the Jewish religion and maybe apply to their own, meaning Christian, Islam, or other?
How do you mean exactly?
Meaning as a Jewish, as being a Jew, so I would read this book and hopefully gain a lot of knowledge about something and be able to apply it to my own life. But if you were just if you're coming from another point of view, if you're coming from another religious point of view. So is there anything that you think in the book specifically you could take out and kind of put into your own life? Or you could
It's an interesting question. I take it to mean something like, is there anything applicable to someone who isn't, right? The main thing that I was after, and I think it's so important now, is just more understanding, right? If a person who is a Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or atheist or whatever, Zoroastrian, reads the book and comes away with it thinking, wow, I have a more nuanced understanding of a subject that I thought I knew something about. I had prejudices about, I had assumptions about, because people do, and walk away from it with those prejudices. I'm not necessarily saying negative prejudices, but just assumptions or beliefs about what people do. I mean, I don't know how many, I'm sure we all have stories of the person that we met who, the thing that comes to mind is like, when the rabbi blesses the kosher meat, these ideas about Judaism that are not based on, anything real. I'm hoping they'll come away with this like, oh, well, there is a real thing there and that was, to be honest, that's like really important to me in this book, was to kind of like explain some of these things, right? Because it's especially the deeper you get into Judaism and we live in our world here. We speak a language that is not accessible to a lot of people, even when we're speaking English. you know? And so I felt like, well, if I could translate, I use this expression a lot in this class, if we can translate English to English, right, in a way that, like, you know, brings people some clarity, that's what I would want them to take away from this, right? So it's less like, it's not like, you know, there's any particular, you know, quotation from the Rambam that they can apply to their lives or something, but more like just the idea that they'll have some idea who the Rambam was and why that's important and why that matters, and why I can call him Rambam and why that has nothing to do with the name Moses Maimonides. You know, like, you know, people who don't know that, they don't know these things, right? And to get these things across, that's kind of what I want. Was that what I really wanted to do, just to share.
Right, we have time for one last question.
I haven't read the book yet, so but my question is about Jewish culture. I think when most people who are not in our world think Jewish culture, they think humor, they think money, they have all sorts of things. Bagels, yeah. Food, right? All these things, or, you know, if they're a little bit more, you know, maybe music, you know, so all the other things that aren't Dalet Amot Shel Halacha, that how do you deal with that at all here? Yeah. Do you nod at it? How do you? Yeah. Because that must be a very complicated.
It's. See, this is okay. I'm just gonna, like, you know, boost my own ego for a second here, because I do think this is one thing that I know people who talk about, you know, like my family, you know, people don't, right? And I'm here, right? And I have the identity I have, right? And so I'm doing this all the time. I'm, like, constantly having to kind of, like, explain these kind of things to people who you know, it's I don't want to be in any way insulting or dismissive of views of culture that are what might, you know, are completely detached from, as you said, Dalet Amot of Halacha, right? That are about, I don't know, literature or culture, as we think of it in secular culture. So I take a lot of time in trying to kind of show that sort of dynamic. What I will say, though, is important to me, and this was, if there's a programmatic, maybe that's too strong a word, but if there is an element that I did have a little bit of an agenda here, it is that I do think that in that more, what should we call it, superstructural culture. I'm just going to go to the Frankfurt School, right? So a superstructural idea of Jewish culture, right? That it's sort of reflected in the day-to-day life of what food you eat or what music you listen to, right? Has taken in a relatively short period of time in Jewish history, taken so much of the airspace in how people understand Judaism, and it's really a distortion of the vast majority of Jewish history, where most people, Jewish identity meant something very discrete and very specific and all-encompassing because they're living within Dalet Amot of Halacha, because that was just what it was, right? Now that's, of course, changed. However, the displacement of the deeper elements of culture, like of you know, the fact that the people we talk about in my, you know, in for instance, my history of Israel class, who, you know, when they made Aliyah as second Aliyah socialists, had a yeshiva education, right? They could read Chumash with Rashi, right? They knew stuff by heart. You know, you can't read a Shai Agnon novel, who's one of the exemplars of modernist Jewish culture and Israeli culture, without, you know, being Yodea Sefer. Like, I mean, you just can't. And so I did feel it was important to me to you know, forefront the depth, rather than to start with, you know, the Latka Wars, right? You know, whatever that book was about the Latka Hamantash, right? Yeah. Maybe that makes me, maybe there's ever so slight of a little bit of a polemical side to it, but that is a position I had with the book. That's important to me. I believe it's important historically, and it's something that I wanted to bring forward. So I'm glad. Thank you for asking the question. Yeah.
All right, Professor Jess Olson, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about your book, Jewish Culture, A Quick Immersion.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
And also big thanks to Itai Shelem, our producer, and to Yeshiva University for sponsoring this series. You too can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. We've got gifts for you. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. And follow me and my co-host Dalia Shenlin on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.